So last week we looked at all sorts of HTML helpers, and if you remember, they fell under a couple different categories. We had standard helpers, and then we had the strongly typed helpers. And the primary difference between the two was that the strongly typed used the keyword for at the end. They also used lambda expressions. And the reason we prefer them is that if there's an error, it shows you the error during compile, whereas the standard helpers basically only show those errors during runtime. And so for validation messages, we also have a standard helper, and we have a strongly typed helper that uses the keyword for along with the lambda expression. And so we'll quick take a look at the standard validation message. And kind of as a side note, the model state is considered to be a property of the controller, which means you can access it from any class that inherits system.web.mvc.controller. And it's the model state's job to take a collection of name value pairs that it gets when you submit a form, and it stores the name value pairs, so the property name and the value that was entered. And then it also stores any error messages. It doesn't do any interpreting of data or anything like that. It basically stores that information for the controller. And how you would set up this standard validation message. If we look at student name here in the model, you can see it is required. And then down here in the view, we have HTML editor, student name, and then we've got the validation message for student name. We're not giving it a special message, so it's just going to bring in that generic one from the model. And as long as there's not an error, this is what you're going to see. So you're going to see the input tag for student name. Then below that, there will be an opening span tag and a closing span tag with no text. The text is only going to be there if there is an error. So this is kind of like a placeholder for an error. Looking at this, you can see we have our Bootstrap classes, and then we've got a couple of data attributes. We use the HTML5 data attributes in our JavaScript programming class. We use them to sort and filter. And here they are being used for validation messages. If you feel like you need a little refresher on the data attribute, I did include a link to that. This little example shows you what that span class would look like if there is an error. So this would be the error that is coming from the model, and this is how it would look live in the form. Now you can override the model's error message if you want. After the property, you can key in whatever you want to display as the error message. To me, that's a lot of extra work. I wouldn't do that. I would specify it up in the model because then the error message would be consistent, and that makes sense. Okay, but it does allow this flexibility. HTML validation message 4, setup very similar. It is used with HTML editor 4. Okay, and this is strongly typed. So we are going to have the lambda expression. And here's basically that same example with student name being required. Here's how you would set it up. And then this is what it converts into. And this is assuming that there is not an error. This next little example, the span class does have text, so there is an error. And this is how it would look like, what it would look like in your form. And again, it does allow you to do more of a custom message. You can either do it in the model, which is where I would do it, or you can do it in the view. Okay, two different places to put your custom message. To me, makes perfect sense to stick it in the model so that you are consistent in your different forms. The last thing we're going to talk about as far as validation helpers is a validation summary. What validation summary does is it lets you put all of the errors above the form. So at the top of the form in a bulleted list, you can list out all the errors. Well, when would that be preferable to displaying the errors below the entry? To me, if you have a really, really long form, it may be preferable to stick the errors above. Okay, but it kind of comes down to a personal preference thing. So how this looks would be, I've got a couple of entry areas and you can see the error message is above my form data. The weird thing about this is you have to use @HTML validation summary, and then you have to give it true or false. False means display the errors as a summary. So if you want to see the errors at the top, you have to use false, which to me seems like backwards. Okay, so that is just something that you're going to have to remember, because if you use true, it's not going to give you the bulleted summary. The HTML anti-forgery token. So I'm sure you guys have noticed this in the views. In fact, if we pull up any views where we're adding data, at the very top, it's got @HTML anti-forgery token. You aren't going to see it any in the details or the index that's displaying, only the views where you can enter data. And this is to help prevent cross-site request forgery. So what the heck is a cross-site request forgery? What is that? So basically, it is someone who has authenticated. So they are an authenticated user that proceeds to execute malicious code on the system. So it's somebody who's been authenticated, so the system trusts them, and then they basically enter their malicious code. And the anti-forgery token helps prevent that. And there's a lot of different kind of techniques that are going on behind the scenes to help it do that. If you would like to know more about this type of hack, I did include a link to that gives you a little bit more background.